let me turn then to the bigger issues of a looming capitalist crisis. I hate to do this. I do not enjoy bringing you gloomy news. So I try to lighten it up with humor. On the other hand, as I've told you many times, if the gloomy news is troubling, go home, turn on the television, and you will not have this problem. All the stations will be competing to give you details about what Donald Trump said this morning. And that's much more fun to pay attention to than all of this stuff. Okay, as you know, or if you don't, let me remind you, when the crash happens in 2008, the capitalist crash, second worst in the history of capitalism, second only to the Great Depression of the 1930s, as I have talked about several times. When that happened, the basic decision of the people who run the major capitalist countries in the world, Europe, Japan, the United States, and so on, did a temporary and a long-term fix, which they hoped would work. The temporary fix was a stimulus plan. It had other names in different countries, but here in the United States, it was called a stimulus plan. The first one was by George Bush in the last months of his presidency in 2008, late summer of 2008. And the second one was early in 2009 when President Obama became president. Obama's was significantly larger than Bush's because by early 2009, the depths and seriousness of the crisis was more acceptable and more understood than it had been Bush. Bush kept trying to say, if you remember, this will pass, it's not a major thing, we'll get taken care of it. By early 2009, nobody believed that anymore. Plus, Bush was gone, there was a new president, there was a lot of hope and change and all the rest, that something would happen. So a big stimulus was undertaken. By stimulus, I mean the government comes in and spends a ton of money. It's very important that this is not complicated. This is not simple. The mass of people are losing their jobs. If they haven't lost their job, they're fearful they're gonna. So nobody's spending any money, and the economy is tanking. The stores can't sell anything. The factories don't have any orders to produce because nobody will buy. So the private sector is falling apart, big time. And so the government steps in, and here, very simple. The government will spend because it has to make up what the private sector isn't spending. The private sector basically collapses. The businesses collapse, they lay off hundreds of thousands. Remember those months where the unemployed people were losing jobs, 500,000-600,000 a month, et cetera, et cetera. Businesses closing, cutting back, laying off workers. So those people don't buy anything. They're terrified, they're traumatized, they have no money, or they're worried that they're not going to have it very long, so they don't buy. In comes the government to buy for them. In other words, the government is going to keep the economy going by being a mass purchaser. That's all this ever meant, stimulus. So here, Obama, for example, started, fixing roads, giving money to the states so that they could fix roads or plow things, or it doesn't even matter. Boost, spend, get it, go out there and spend money. And where did the government get the money? If it's going to spend like crazy when the private sector isn't, you realize you got a problem. Because with the private sector collapse, nobody's paying taxes, right? All those unemployed people, they don't pay taxes. All those business reductions mean they pay lower taxes. So just as less money is coming into the government, it is going to spend like crazy. That's a problem. If you have less money coming in and you spend more, there's a problem. How do you solve this problem? You borrow the money. Well, where do you borrow the money from if you're the government of the United States? You go to two places. First, you go to the private sector. The rich people who of course are not investing in business because the business is collapsing. They're not going to invest. They're not going to hire more workers. They're not going to hire more inputs. They're not going to expand the factory because the reality is they can't sell what they're already producing. So they're sitting on an enormous amount of money which they're not going to invest, which is the problem. Nobody, by them not investing, they're not buying stuff. And they're not hiring people. So they're sitting on the money. So the government comes to them and says, lend us the money. We'll spend it. And it's a good thing for you, Mr. Capitalist or Ms. Capitalist. Because here's the game. You're in trouble because the private sector's falling apart. You can't sell what you produce. You can't hire anybody. We're going to save you. You lend us the money you're not spending. We'll spend it on the stuff you produce. And we'll pay you interest for letting us do that for you. All right, we need a moment now for the national anthem. This is an extraordinary way of solving a problem by rewarding the people who created the problem. And that's what we do. That's how it's done. Of course, there's an alternative. The government could come in to all the rich people and say, look, this is a crisis you brought on. So if you've got a lot of money that you're not spending because the economy's no good, and it's no good because you made all kinds of decisions that led us to this point, we're going to tax the money from you, and then we'll spend it. We'll help you, we'll spend it, but we're not going to also pay you interest to allow us to help you. That's a little much. But fortunately, we don't have anybody in political power who would do that. That's why we are choosing between Trump and Clinton and not between Stein and Johnson. Okay? Because those other ones might actually come up with an idea like that, like taxing the rich when they have messed everything up, rather than rewarding them. Anyway, the government borrows from the rich, spends all that money to keep the economy going, whereupon the rich get scared, having lent all that money to the government, which has rescued them, worried that the government may not pay them back, may default on those enormous loans that they just made to the government that used the money to save them. So they say to the government, hey, we need to see some clear signs that you're going to pay back all of the deficits that you ran. The implication being that the government did something wrong by borrowing all that money to save them. They just got saved, and now they're attacking the saviors for having spent more than they ought to. But they spent it on you. How did you get to this craziness? That, the answer is the genius of capitalism. That's what we do. Yes, you're enjoying it. That's good. Listen, you're either going to laugh at this or you're going to cry. So the laughter is probably the better bet here. So the stimulus helped, but it immediately got shut down because the people who had lent didn't want to see more. They didn't want to see a government that was unable to pay back. So what is the longer-term way you're going to keep the economy going? If the stimulus happens at the initial point, gets us back into an okay situation, but can't be continued. In every country, that stimulus was endorsed by everybody to get us out of the collapse, and then immediately turned around and shut down. The shutting down of a stimulus, that's called austerity. Austerity comes immediately after the stimulus. Immediately after the government spends a fortune, which all of the supporters of austerity voted for. Then they immediately turn around and say, no more of that. It's like, wealthy people who gentrify a neighborhood. They come into the neighborhood, and now they want the little shops that they came into the neighborhood for to be preserved. They don't want anybody else to come. Then they discover that gentrification doesn't work like that. They have to move to a new neighborhood where the same thing happens. So what happens to keep the support of the economy going? Well, starting in 2009 and 10, no more stimulus. The alternative is monetary policy. What does that mean? Well, in this country, it's called quantitative easing. Don't worry about the name. It's very simple. You flood the economy with money. The central bank just prints it, which, you know, that's what they do. Again, just for all that you remember. How is it decided how many $100 bills or $50? How is it decided how much money there is? Americans have fantasies about this that are extraordinary. They're right up there with sexual fantasies. The sheer variety is stunning. Okay? Here's how it works. The Federal Reserve, that little body you read about from time to time, whose president, whose chair is now Janet Yellen, you see her name around, they sit around and they decide how much money to print. That's it, folks. They sit around and they decide. And when 12 of them, the Board of Governors and Mrs. Yellen, and they sit around, they say, let's see, first question, do we want more money or less? They discuss, they decide. Let's say they decided more because they didn't have. Then the next question is, how much more? And then they have a conversation and they decide that. Then Mrs. Yellen says, thank you. They all go off, play golf. She calls the mint and says, roll them. That's it. That's how it's done. There's no mystery. There's no nothing. You can't do that. They'll arrest you if you make money yourself. The only other people who can make money are banks. Banks make money by giving you a little electronic notification in your account. You go and have a conversation. That's it. You have a conversation with a bank officer in one of those desks with the fake flowers in the back. You know that. You sit there, you have a conversation with this person. You try to imagine what kind of life it is to have these conversations all day. You get over that. You agree on something. You're taking out a loan. Great, they say. Here it is. And they credit your account at the bank with $10,000. That's the loan you asked for. You now have $10,000 worth of checks to go out and buy things. They work like money. They are money. That's it. The government prints and you make loans. That's how money is created. No mystery. Is there somebody who sits in the sky and allows us to make more or less money? No. Do we have to worry that the money we have has some relationship to gold? No. What determines the amount of money? Whatever these people's conversations result in. And they're mighty free to do whatever they want. They don't need Congress's approval, they don't need the president's approval, and they don't need your approval. That's it. So we began a program, as did many other countries, to pump up the money supply, to pump money into the hands of everybody we could get it into, in the hope, that was the idea. By the way, quantitative easing, making it easier for large quantities of money to get into the economy. That's all it means. That's all it means. That's what we did. For example, the Federal Reserve lowered the interest rate, make it easy for everybody to borrow. Borrow what? The new money. No problem. No problem. And the government itself started buying all kinds of securities in the market. Government securities, private securities. The government just printed the money and bought the stuff. So we flooded the economies of the world with money. And the interest rates went very low. And the hope was that this would keep the economies going. It didn't. The recovery has still not happened, even here in the United States, which has had a bit of a better situation than the Europeans or the Japanese, who are in real trouble. I mean, we are too, but they're in worse trouble, both of them. The Chinese, that's different. They're at a different stage of their economic development. They're chugging along. They're doing a pretty good job. It infuriates the New York Times, which cannot publish an article that's good about China no matter what happens. For the New York Times, the Cold War has never ended, and for many others, it hasn't either. You can see that again in the current shenanigans with Putin and Russia and Syria, which is scarily close to warfare on certain days when you pick up the paper. But accepting those things, this is a system that hasn't worked.
The stock market's doing great, right?
Yes. Well, we're going to get to that. So the money came in, tons of money was created, but it didn't lead to businesses hiring workers. It didn't lead to production. It didn't lead to the recovery of a functioning economy. Where did the money go? The people who got the money, the bankers, the people who deal with the government in money, they are now confronted with a new problem. Interest rates were so low. Interest rates were so low that they had no place to invest profitably. Try to imagine a bank, I mean, it's hard for some of you, I can imagine, sloshing around with huge amounts of money. That was their problem. Where are you going to put it? You can't lend it to the people. The people won't borrow anymore. They can't afford what they got in the way of debts. The mass of people, not in this country, they're done. And many, many corporations, they're not going to borrow in order to expand production. That would be crazy. You wouldn't want to borrow money, expand production, when you can't sell what you already have been producing. So where did the money go? One, stock market. Okay, we'll start buying stocks. And if I buy stocks and drive up the price a little bit, then you can come along and say, well, I can do that too. So the prices of the stock market get bid up, and it's self-reinforcing because the money you invest in the stock will give you a profit if someone comes along and buys it at a higher price from you, who's doing the same thing with that sloshing money that you did. That can go on for a while. But what it is stock prices rising, but no longer connected to anything real being produced. If you read what I mentioned to you before, the HSBC Red Alert today, the Bank of America last week, the Goldman Sachs, that's what they're all saying. This is not a stock market that's going to survive because it's got no connection between these rising prices, which make stockholders wealthy, nothing is being produced. There's no work being done. There's millions of people not even in the labor force. They're giving up, all those paying the workers. But now, hold it. But something did happen. Around the world, as interest rates came down, every company in trouble anywhere in the world had a lifeline. It could now borrow money at virtually no cost. Interest rates are close to zero. It means a corporation can go out and borrow $100 million. It doesn't cost them anything. There's no interest rate. It's 0.5% or less. So all over the world, particularly in third world countries, Asia, Africa, Latin America, every company in difficulty that couldn't sell its stuff borrowed to keep itself going. We today have the highest rate of debt relative to GDP around the world. We've never had it before. The level of debt of our corporations is wild because they borrowed. That was a side effect of these low interest rates. They all borrowed. But they didn't borrow to produce anything. What did they borrow for? To merge with one another. That was a way of making money because you would borrow it at no cost. You'd buy the other company, particularly your own competitor, and then you wouldn't need two headquarters, would you? You wouldn't need two sets of executives. You wouldn't need two of those lovely buildings with the lovely shrubbery in the front and all that crap that big corporations love to do. You don't need two of them, just need one. You'd save a lot of money. You'd fire all the middle managers and a whole lot of the truck drivers in the two. You'd say that would be a way of making money. There'd be no point in growing production because there's nothing in that, but saving, unifying, mergers, acquisitions, playing on the stock market, that. Or here's another one, playing in the real estate market. Go buy an apartment in San Francisco, buy one in London, and have somebody come along who's borrowed money just like you, buy it from you at a 10% increase. Oh, great. Now you go buy another one and another. There we go. The money found its way into gentrification, into mergers and acquisitions, and to a level of debt. Well, now here's the problem. If there's a recession, if there's a downturn, particularly a stiff one, these companies can't pay back those debts. The debts are too high. They can't get through even a small downturn because they are loaded up with debt that has to be serviced. They have to pay the interest, they have to pay back the amortization, the bit-by-bit repayment. They can't do it. And that's one of the reasons HSBC and Goldman Sachs are scared to death, because they can see if we have a downturn now, the debt load carried by corporations around the world can't handle a reduction in the flow of revenue they have. They will default on these debts, and then we will have catastrophe. Number one. Number two. By the way, this goes back to the beginning of tonight. Is this being discussed by our leading candidates? Not a word. They're not troubled. They're trying to figure out what exactly Mr. Trump said on that bus with that other jerk, and all. That's the exciting. So where are we now? The flooding of money has produced not only not the recovery, but produced all these byproducts of inflated real estate prices, inflated stock price. This is scary. What are we going to do? And now governments are beginning to decide it's so bad that maybe we'll have to go back and begin to do more stimulus, the very thing we didn't want to do in the last 8 years. And now you see in Britain, in Europe, in the United States, more and more talk about, well, maybe the government is going to have to borrow again a vast amount of money and stimulate because nothing else seems to be working. So you're going to see a debate. By the way, when the government spends money, it's called fiscal policy. When the government pumps in money, it's called monetary policy, for those of you that are interested. But you're going to be seeing discussions about rebuilding our cities, rebuilding our infrastructure. This is because this government spending directly, because all this indirect money manipulation hasn't worked out. Last point for today.
Could you clarify that distinction just once again, monetary and fiscal?
Monetary policy is how the Federal Reserve manipulates the money system of America. Fiscal policy is how the Congress raises taxes and spends money. A stimulus program is something Congress does. It pumps purchasing into the economy. The Federal Reserve doesn't purchase, it pumps money into the economy, hoping other people will use that to make the purchases. The private sector doesn't like the government to come in because the government's a competitor. And the American people, seeing the government keeping the economy floating, are going to be given the idea that the government is the solution and private enterprise is the problem. That's not good for them. They don't want that. They want monetary policy because that's the government working deals out with the banks, and that's another private sector, and so there isn't the government directly getting its hands in there. The government is always an option in a capitalist system, and that freaks out the private sector because there's always then the risk. The mass of people will say, let's have the government do it. It works out better for us. There's a very dangerous direction for things to go. That's a political issue. All right, here's the underlying problem, as profound as anything I've told you about. And that's why it's at the end. Over the last 30 years, and continuing since the crash of 2008, the gap between rich and poor has gotten worse and worse. This is extremely important because the more wealth is concentrated in rich people, the less is available to the mass of people. The mass of people take the money they earn and spend it. The really rich earn a great deal of money that they do not spend. I mean, how many yachts can you have? How many meals can you eat? Seriously. So if you're Bill Gates, you can't consume $50 billion. You can't. So you save it. But the more you put wealth concentrated in rich people, the less demand for goods and services there is, because they can't. And if you keep doing it for 4 or 5 decades, which is what we've done, you're getting to a point now where the mass of people can't consume what the economy has built itself up to be able to produce. It can't. In the 1970s, we began with that problem. We solved it by having everybody borrow to spend. Keep up your spending by filling up your credit card balances, by borrowing for your house, by borrowing for your car, and in the last 20 years, by borrowing for your college kid. If you want to see how this works, China today. China today is pressuring its population to begin using credit cards, like Americans, because they're trying to shift their economy from a dependence on exports, which is the Chinese story to this day, to become an economy dependent on its own people. But its own people can't afford to buy anything, but on credit they could, so they're now going down that path with all the dangers that implies. But here in this country, the mass of working people's wages are going nowhere. The mass of working people cannot borrow anymore. They can't afford the debts they already carry. So there's no way to solve the problem. The government has to come in and spend, but that freaks out the business community, which doesn't want to see the government borrowing more than it can pay back. Because remember, friends, if the government can't pay it back, then the rich people say, we lent you all this money, you have to pay us back. And the government says, well, if we have to pay you back, since the economy isn't generating income for us, then the only way we can pay you back is to lay off the firefighters and the cops and the teachers, and by not paying them, use the money instead to pay off the debt. We are in a time of global capitalist crisis. The very solutions it found, like easy money, have come back to bite the system in the rear end. The unintended, the undesired consequences are now accumulating, and the play, what to do, how to go, is being constricted and constrained at every way. And I believe, without being mystical, I believe that somewhere in the American mentality, deflected and confused and distorted as the media and others make it, somewhere they get it. That we're confronted by these two, I'm trying to be polite, these two candidates. Is this the best this country can do? These two? These two? Wow. And I think a large number of Americans, we'll see what the votes look like, but a large number of Americans are shaking their head, and they know somewhere that there's a disconnect between this theater that we have every day now and the problems that are part of our lives that we're living through. It is an extraordinary coming to a crunch. Capitalism is just a system. It's just a particular way of doing things. This is my conclusion. Slavery was another kind of economic system. Feudalism was another kind of economic system. In slavery, one person was literally the property of another, like a donkey or a machine. It existed in many parts of the world for hundreds, in some cases thousands of years. It is a system that was born, that evolved over time, and then it died. It was pushed away. It finished. Feudalism came afterward. Feudalism, the lord and the serf instead of the master and the slave. The lord and the serf, a different relationship. It was born, it evolved, it died. The logical expectation is that capitalism was born, evolved, and ... And the question that once you understand, then the question has to be asked now, but always. Is that what's happening? Is it over? And what in the world would that mean? And where do we go next? And what's the alternative? Because, you know, the end of slavery wasn't peaceful. And the end of feudalism wasn't. That's when capitalism was born in Europe. Remember? Remember the young capitalist businessmen and bankers of France? They took the Louis and they took him to a place and they separated him from his head. And that was the kind of a very symbolic end of feudalism, and never quite recovered from that activity. So it's a tough situation, and I think obviously I don't know what's going to happen any better than anybody else does. I can't predict the future. But I can tell you, I've never seen this system that I've been studying all my life in this level of, it's like a chess game that's been reduced to only a few pieces left, and you realize that the guy or the woman you're playing with knows how to play this better than you do because there are no moves left. They're really, you can't, every time you think of going this way or this, but each time you think of a move to make, you can see how the other player is going to get you that way. And I notice among my friends who are right-wingers, economists, or center, or lefties like me, we don't agree on how we got into this mess, and we don't agree on how to get out of it. But we do agree that none of us have ever seen an economic system boxed in the way this one has boxed itself in. And of course, the scary risk is that when you're squeezed like that, when you're blocked, you take extreme measures. Wars are ways of getting out of this kind of situation. Fascism, a radical top-down reorganization of the economy, is a temptation. And you see right-wing political movements and parties in our country and, in many other countries beginning to. Berlin, which is doing these interesting things about gentrification, had an election 2 weeks ago. And in that election, the left came out really strong. The Die Linke party was the biggest gainer in that. All the other parties basically shrank. The left, the most left party in Germany now got, I believe, 17, 18% of the vote. Yes, yeah, very big. And the right-wing party got about 15% of the vote, so that's significant for them. But you're seeing, as we are in this country too, you're seeing a kind of polarization and the consensus, the last 50 years after World War II is dissolving, and it's dissolving everywhere and quickly. And it's hard to do in the amount of time we have to get a sense of the squeezed position. You are not living in an economic system that's got everything under control. It isn't under control. It's falling apart. And the effort to tell you it isn't falling apart, which is half of what this election is about, shouldn't fool you. Nothing is going to be solved in the next 3 weeks. Nothing. Not by these two. And so we're going to be confronted with these issues that we've talked about in a very stark way, at a system that is run out of ways of coping, and that's going to make the months ahead very tumultuous.